Well, I have 4:31. I can't see the clock on my computer.
That's what I have.
4:31.
Okay. All right. I think we're all here, and we could officially call the Light Board meeting to order for June 24th at 4:30. And with that, I don't know if someone's remote that I can't tell, but in case someone's, can I tell if anyone else is dialed into this meeting?
There are 5 other people on that are attending.
Okay. All right. I guess I'm not seeing that. So I just want to clarify our rules for that meeting, because as usual, Zoom is new for all of us. So if people are participating, we're going to use the raise hand function and the chat functions. If you're going to send questions, please send questions to all panelists and attendees. And if you dialed in, I'll ask you to identify yourself by phone, identify yourself by name. We will review the chat questions at the end of the meeting, although I think, Alice, if again you could respond to any questions that come up that are easy to answer in the chat, that would be helpful again.
Okay.
And then we'll obviously be recording this meeting again and post it. I think people appreciated that last posting, so it's a good idea. So, okay, with that, moving on to meeting minutes. I know, Alice, you just sent the meeting minutes from March around, and I know we haven't really had time to meet it to review those. So I think I'm correct, we have no meeting minutes to review. So with that, we can move right on to the director's meeting, Dave. Update,
Okay.
rather.
Oh wait, can I ask one question before we move
Sure.
on? It says upcoming meeting dates.
Yes.
Are we not meeting in July?
No, we should be meeting in July.
I don't see it on the
That
update.
is good.
That
Okay.
was a boo-boo on my part. I apologize.
Okay, so we are going to meet.
Yep.
Okay.
Right, and that I don't have I can't look at it.
July 8th was the day. I don't know about time.
Is it July 8th? That's the second Wednesday. Okay. Great. I'm
At
on
least that's
vacation.
what's been on my calendar.
Okay.
Happy to change it to a different July date if it works.
Well, just a comment. So I am going to be remote up in Maine, I hope, on July 8th on an island. So my connectivity might be a little suspect. I'm still willing to chair, but I would, if July 8th is the date, would like to see if someone would like to volunteer to play chair for that meeting.
I could do that.
Could you do that, Alice? That'd be great. I appreciate that. And I'll do the reverse. I can be clerk, assuming I can still hear. So we can do that. Thank you. I appreciate it. So just to reaffirm, July 8th is our next meeting. And are we doing this at night again, Dave? We've been doing these 5 o'clocks. Is that because of Zoom, or do we go back to our 7 o'clock in the morning slot?
We can do whatever works for the board.
Okay. Okay. Can I just take a quick poll? I know I sometimes, it's not going to be a problem on July 8th, but business hours are tough for me, but the mornings do work. Does anybody else have a preference?
My preference would be for 7:30 in the morning.
7:30. Okay.
Personally, I like 5 at night,
Yeah. Okay.
but I can easily do 7:30.
Okay.
July 8th will be remote.
Yes. Yep.
I mean, I will be remote, even more remote.
Yes. Okay. All right. So let's plan on 7:30. As long as that works, Dave, for your team, that's great.
Yeah, it should be fine.
All right. So with that, I think we can now move on to the director's update, Dave.
Okay. Just a quick update on the operating procedures. We're still operating with 2 teams, like I mentioned at the last meeting. The offices remain closed to the public. We are getting quite a bit of activity, calls and things of that nature. So we've been handling the workload relatively good. It's tricky, but work's getting done. We are still working on a reopening plan for the whole town. We're making some strides there. Don't have any definitive dates yet, but we are putting in quite a bit of time. The Cambridge Turnpike project I mentioned at the last meeting. The broadband team finished the installation and the conversion of the fiber in phase 1. So that was great. We only had to shut off 4 people, so the redesign really worked favorably. So all of the utilities are now de-energized. Our electric system on the overhead is removed. The overhead fiber optics is removed. And Verizon has converted their stuff as well.
Yay.
They have started removing the poles. So they started at the farm stand, and they've gotten 3 removed so far. Do still have a little bit of work out at the intersection of Lexington Road, but for the most part, all the utilities are converted at this point. So
Great.
quite a milestone, and it was a lot of work, but it moved along quite well.
Great.
We just completed substation maintenance at both station 219 and 223. We do this every 2 to 3 years, where you test the circuit breakers, all the relays, make sure they're all functioning properly. So that was done. That was a good thing. We have a camera project, installation project going on. We installed them at station 219 and 223. And we started the operation center, and all the wiring's done. The cameras just need to be mounted, and that's been a long time coming, but it's a good thing because we do have people dump trash and whatnot. So we actually just got off a meeting not too long ago with the new owners of 300 Baker Avenue. They gotta have a big plan to what they want to do efficiency-wise, and solar, geothermal, and battery storage, possibly EV charging stations. But they want them to be carbon neutral, and so it really dovetails well with our goals as a community. So we're working with them on that. But the array would be a 3 megawatt array. It would include top and canopy. So very exciting project that we're partnering with them on potentially. And at the last light board meeting, I mentioned we were recruiting a new CIO. I mentioned we had received 93 applicants. It was actually 94. But myself and our IT consultant went through the screenings. It was a grueling process. But we narrowed it down to 7 candidates to bring in for first round interviews. And then if they don't work out, we have a second group that the candidates are qualified as well, of 8. So there's a total of 15 potential solid candidates. And Karen just finished scheduling the interviews for the 1st and 2nd of July. So we'll have first round done by the 2nd of July. And then we'll work on scheduling round 2 with the town manager and who he puts on that panel. So making some good progress there, which is exciting.
Right.
Great.
Great.
Since
And that's all I have for an update since we just talked 2 weeks ago.
since we just met. Great. Okay, then we can move right on into the cost of service rate design discussion. We obviously had a good presentation last month by the consultants, and I think we were going to dig into the cost of service and the allocation methodology. And I'm assuming Laura might be taking on the next step. I'm not sure.
Yes, Wendy, thank you.
Okay.
So I've prepared a presentation for the board, basically at your request, that I put together my own overview of the cost of service study, which I've done here. I've chosen an ocean theme because when I was putting this together, it was very hot and very dry, and I thought I'd like to be at a place that was cool and wet. So hence the turtle.
So Laura, before you get going,
Yes,
Yep.
sir.
I just want to add that Laura's going to go through this thing, but I'm actually running the presentation from where I am. So hopefully we'll be coordinated. I think we will be, but just, to make everyone aware.
Dave and I are like a fine-tuned machine. So if we go to the next slide, what we're going to talk about is review again of the major findings of the study. And again, at your request, go into the allocation methodology in a little bit more detail rather than relying on a blanket statement of this is standard industry practice. I want to give you a flavor for what some of those allocation methodologies look like. And then there was also a request to line up some decision points that need to be made before we can move on to further phases of the rate study. And finally, we're going to look at CMLP's electric rates compared to 45 other Massachusetts utilities. So major findings. Fortunately, there are really only two in my mind. The first is that current rates are generally sufficient to meet CMLP's forecasted revenue requirement during the period 2020 to 2025, depending on the desired return on rate base percentage. So we'll look at a slide in a minute that will show you what our projected net income is by year, both without any return and with a modest return. I do want to point out, however, that even though rates are sufficient to meet expenses, it is planned that rates will increase about 3% per year from 2020 to 2022 in order to institute the board's recommended REC surcharge schedule, which you see here listed to the right. These were potential increases on potential dates that were discussed in the past, and I put them up here just for reference. So that's the first major finding. The second major finding, oh, sorry, Dave, go back a slide, is that the consultants are showing a $2.5 million cross subsidy occurring between the residential and general service, also known as commercial service, rate classes. This is primarily G2 and G3 subsidizing G1. So we'll look at both major findings. First one first. Are rates sufficient? Okay, next slide. I don't know. I'm hoping you can all see this, but it depends, I suppose, what media you're using to access this. In the upper half of the page, circled in red, are the projected net incomes per year before a return on rate base calculation. So what this shows is projected operating revenues, projected operating expenses, and then payments for pilot and depreciation. And what the red circled figures show you is they're all positive except for 2025, which means there's enough money to pay for all the expenses and the pilot and the depreciation and still have money left over. So that's what I mean by rates are generally sufficient to meet the cost of service, 2025 being the one exception. However, the upper half of the page calculations do not include any return on rate base. And so the calculations below use a very modest return of only 2%. Many utilities use 5 to 6, but in the past, I think historically, CMLPs use 2 to 3%. I modeled 2 here. And it shows now in the blue circled numbers, what happens to net income after a return on rate base calculation is included. And while there's still money left over in 2020, we're showing slight shortfalls in 21 through 24, and then a rather larger shortfall in 2025 if we include that 2% return as an expense. And there'll be more to discuss about that later. Are there any questions about major finding number 1 or any of these figures?
So Laura, it's Wendy. So what did you do on the revenue expectations? I know that we had a discussion around the rec purchase surcharge and increased it, but overall, the revenue increase from sales looks kind of flat.
Right. So we haven't projected a substantial increase in sales volumes. Although we hope EVs and beneficial electrification will take off at some point, there is not a huge uptick in sales. So that's one reason why the revenues look rather flat. Plus, we don't change base rates. The only thing we change, and you see it in the line called rec purchase surcharge, shows those increases according to the schedule that was listed on the previous slide. However, you'll also see those rec purchase increases in the expense line. So basically whatever we're collecting in the renewable energy surcharge is then being spent on renewable energy each year, so that does not have an effect on net income.
Yeah, that makes sense.
I had a question about purchase costs. Laura, this is Lynn.
Yes.
I think purchase costs reflect our current contracted commitments and forward prices for anything that hasn't yet been contracted. Is that right?
That's correct.
Just to clarify.
So just to follow up on that, Lynn, so how did we project, if we don't have a contract, how did we project that purchase cost? Do we just use some general trend?
No, we use actual forward market prices. So, you know, whatever's transactable at the time we prepare the forecast, like what buyers are willing to pay and what sellers are willing to sell, that's the number we use.
Got it.
Okay, let's move on now to major finding number 2. No?
So that number could fluctuate any day,
Uh,
the forward market.
It could. Keep in mind that, you know, only 15 to 50% over this time horizon of the book is uncommitted. So for example, for 2020, market price fluctuations are not going to impact our power purchase cost all that much because we're not buying that much from the market. But in 2025, it would be to a greater degree.
Okay, thank you.
That's helpful. Thank you, Laura.
Okay, major finding number 2, this pesky cross subsidy. So the consultant found that there's a roughly $2.5 million cross subsidy occurring between residential and general service rate classes. And one of the questions we talked about last time was what assumptions led to the determination that there's this $2.5 million subsidy occurring? And I struggled for quite a while to think of a way to describe to you how the allocation methodology works. And I start off by telling you something that you probably aren't surprised to hear, and that is that the allocation methodology used by the consultants is complex. But to give you a flavor for kind of what it looks like, I thought it would be helpful to look at 2 examples of how costs were allocated. And I'm going to, in both cases, focus on the residential class, since that's the class that's been determined to be underpaying its fair share. So how was its fair share calculated? So the 2 examples we're going to look at is how the residential class was allocated roughly $1.8 million of ISO forward capacity costs. It's a total cost of about $3.7 million. So why did they get allocated 1.8? How does that work? How do we calculate what they're supposed to be paying? The second example is again for the residential class, but this time it's what they were allocated for administration and general salaries. That's about a $750,000 cost. The 2 methodologies are quite different, and I thought it would be informative to look at the 2 of them. Before we go there, let's go to the next slide, Dave. Let's just take a revisit, a quick look back. This is the same slide that Baker Tilly presented 2 weeks ago at the meeting. I've put some nice fish on there to distract you in case you get board looking at these, but this is where I'm talking about that $2.5 million subsidy. You see residential is under their cost of service by 2.1, residential assistance by 142,000, time of use by 24, et cetera, et cetera. So if you add up all those negatives, okay, that's roughly 2.5 million. If you add up all the positives, which are largely occurring in the medium general service and the large general service, again, it's $2.5 million. So the total cost of service, which we already decided was sufficient, and you see that again where the line on the totals that says only $22,000 out of $28 million budget, we're only $22,000 off. It's almost uncanny how our current rates, which are in the line title 28,288,000, almost exactly equal what we expect our cost of service to be, which is 28,310,000. It's only $22,000 different. So the rates are sufficient, but within the rate classes, there are these overpayments and underpayments. And that's what we want to talk about. So with that, Dave, if we could go to the Excel sheet, Excel workbook. Okay, great. The first highlighted cell there is 1.837 million. That's the same number I showed on the slide earlier where I said I was going to explain how does that $1.837 million cost, where does that come from? How's that calculated? The total cost, what we expect to spend for ISO FCM is 3.7 million, and we're saying the residential rate class should get 1.8. If we go over to column U, we'll find the arithmetic operations that result in this $1.837 million cost. Essentially, it is 49.47% of the total, the $3.7 million total. But where does the 49.47% come from? That comes from the ratio of two other volumetric numbers, 13,796 and 27,888. What's the 13,796? It's 84% of 16,406. But what's the 84%? That's another ratio called the coincidence factor, which is the ratio of the average of all of the 6 to 7 p.m. hours in September of the test year, which was 2017, and the maximum hour in September. The reason we're taking this calculation is because the allocation methodology for this cost is called CP1, or coincident peak 1. And that means we're going to allocate the costs according to that customer class's usage during 1 hour, the highest hour of the year. So the 84% is the ratio or the coincidence factor that was developed from that 1 hour highest use. Well, where does the 16,406 come from? That's another number, 15,914 divided by 1 minus 1.5% minus 1.5. It's essentially grossing up the 15,914 number for losses from primary to secondary and secondary to the meter on the electric distribution system. Where does 15,914 come from? That's another number, and it's equal to what our billing system told the consultant was our recorded use for September, the total, divided by 58.91%, which is what we call the residential load factor, times the number of hours in September. And the residential load factor is calculated as the average KWH of all the hours in September divided by the 1 hour maximum use in September. And finally, the 27,888 from above is the sum of all the maximum monthly coincident peaks at the input voltage. So as you can see, there's not really one answer to this question. There are many. I'm not expecting or hoping you to kind of follow every single thought process in those operations, but just to understand that it is complex. The other
So
one
no
I'd like to,
test?
sorry,
So no test?
what does it mean, no test?
We don't have to take a test on this?
Thank
Only
you.
you, Peggy.
It's all load-based, it sounds like. I mean, it's all proportional.
It's really,
Yes.
Usage.
I sort of followed it for the first half, and it's fascinating.
Yes. There are
We thought it
many,
wasn't, I did,
Who followed the whole thing?
not me.
That was fascinating.
and I just want to point out that this is just one cell in a vast labyrinth of cells that calculate these costs. But they do all boil down to some primary assumptions about who uses energy when, and therefore what costs, should be allocated to them. Let's look at another type of allocator. Dave, if you go down to, I can't see because it's too small. Are you down at F139?
Hold on a second, Laura. Wendy, I don't know if you want to take questions now or not, but Brian has his hand up.
Sorry, I was muted. It's probably best to take the question now if it's very specific to this example. So Brian, I don't know if that is. Do you want to speak to your one question? We can try to answer it, assuming it's part of this.
Yes, thank you. Laura, this is awesome. Dave, do you
I knew
mind
you would
going-
like this, Brian.
I know, this is the kind of stuff I geek out about. Can you go back to that calculation section which you talked about the amount of capacity to residential? Yeah. So I too had a little bit of trouble following that whole algorithm, and I don't think I'd pass the test at the end. But I wanted to ask a simple question. So this, you talked about coincident peak, yet I know that a lot of our dumb meters don't capture data that is coincident. So your calculations are using the amount consumed over certain periods of time to guess at what that coincident peak would be. Is that a correct digestion of it, or is there more industry standard divisions or not so much calculations, but assumptions?
So that's an excellent question / point, Brian. Because we do not have smart meter data for all of our customers, and therefore cannot determine exactly what our own residential classes peak demand was, what the study has done, which is not abnormal, is to take a nearby utility, an IOU in particular, Eversource, in this case, in our geographic region, for which hourly data is available. And we've taken their percentages for their rate classes versus their total. Okay, so let's say Eversource's residential load used 0.017932, okay, during their peak hour in September for the residential class. We take that same percent and multiply it by our known residential billing, okay, which comes from the monthly data, to come up with the hourly load profile.
That is that's good to hear, because it's far more accurate than I assumed the industry standard would be. So I'm pleased with that. I would rather have full smart meter deployment and have our own data, but I do really appreciate breaking down the math like that and the complicated calculation, because it is an assumption, but it is quite a good one using real data from Eversource to kind of approximate our own.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Laura, for entertaining that.
Anything else before we move on, Wendy?
No, I think that's good. You know, this is tricky, so it is best to answer these questions while we're here. So thanks.
So I wanted to look at another type of allocator that's quite different than the CP1, but that's also responsible for a substantial amount of dollars to the residential class. Because again, we're asking ourselves the question, why has the residential class been assigned this certain amount of cost that their current revenue is not collecting? And so the second one is in this row F139, there's a $747,000 allocation to the residential class. And the allocator is called expense. The total A&G for that expense category for the year is 1.15 million. So why did residential get 747,000? This one, I'm happy to say, has many fewer operations. It's merely 64.91% of the total. And the 64.91% comes from the ratio of two numbers, 1579 and 2432. And Dave, if you'll go back to our slides and go to slide 9, you'll see those same figures at the bottom under something called non-PP fuel, the 1579 and the 2432. Essentially what the rate study has done is it said for something like A&G, it's difficult to figure out how this should be allocated. And so what they've done is they've taken all of the non-power purchase expenses that were allocated to the residential class. So that stuff in yellow, the 30,153, the 15,677, etc. And they've said all that stuff adds up to 1.579 million. All that stuff for the total adds up to 2.432. And so we're going to take the ratio of that and say that residential is going to be responsible for this 64.91%. So that's how that allocator works. That one's called expense. If we go to slide 10, I've listed here all of the allocators and a short description that are used in the cost of service study. It's missing a couple. It's missing the CP1 and CP4, but they're pretty easy to explain if you understand CP12. But you can see that the expense one was listed as a blended allocator based on all non-fuel expenses, all non-power purchase expenses. And the allocators attempt to customize allocation factors according to the use at hand. So we looked at just expense allocations, but there are also capital allocations. Many of them rely upon an NBV or net book value related allocator. If we were trying to allocate meter reading expenses, we might want to look at one of the meter reading weighted allocators. So each of these is designed to be relevant, if you will, for the appropriate cost category. This list is a general list of what the industry uses to allocate these costs. So these are what Russ kept referring to as sort of standard industry practice, and these have been used for many years for this purpose. So I hope that that brief walk through two actual allocation examples and then the list of allocators might shed a little bit more light on this issue than we were able to cover at the last meeting.
So, Laura, I've got a question. I think what caught people's eye when we were talking about this before, and it's helpful to understand this methodology, was that when we got to the general service group, we walked through some details, and there were some like factors where things were being multiplied for the business areas. And I think that's what caught a lot of people's question about, well, what is that factor of 5 and why is it 5? I don't remember the particular element, but and while you're walking through residential here, is there something different about the business allocation that's different? Because I think that people are sort of curious about why, you know, if this cross subsidization may have something to do with the factors, and it's really the business side of things that looks higher. And
Well, keep in mind, the result of the cost of service study is that the general service people are overpaying.
Right.
So if we're multiplying by factors of 3 and 5, and I can explain that in just a second,
Yep.
Even though we might be doing that, it's still showing that they're overpaying. So it's kind of going in the wrong direction, if you will.
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out if the allocation for business is different from a methodology perspective than what you've walked through here for residential. Are they all the same?
I'm sorry to equivocate here, but basically those factors that you saw were for things like how much time it takes to prepare, let's say, a large general service bill than it does to prepare a residential bill. So when we look at these allocators, Wendy, do you see like the meter read weight? It says number of customers adjusted for the time it takes to read each type of meter, or adjusted for the cost to purchase meters and associated equipment. So large general service customers have different meters than residential customers, and they're more expensive.
Yep.
So those weightings were designed to account for differences in the amount of cost and time it takes to support large commercial accounts versus, say, residential accounts.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
And Brian has his hand up.
Yeah, I'm just gonna go there next.
Thank you.
Brian, you want to ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. Do you mind going back a slide to, I think it's slide 9, or yes, oop, that one. So Laura, when you were presenting this, you said that this was based on, you took out all of the power supply portions, yet I see the first 2 listed as transmission, which is normally considered part of power supply. Is that accurate, or is, because I understand, oh, you're muted, yeah.
Yeah, so a couple things. One, I didn't take them out. I'm just showing you what the results of the cost of service study are. But that's partly also to blame for the language barrier here. The consultants, when they talk about transmission, they're talking about the distribution system that operates at what they think of as a transmission level. It's stepped up. It's not stepped down at the residential level.
So inside of Concord, substation to substation.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. So that is in town. It's part of the distribution network, which is something that we all should pay for outside of power supply.
Correct. It's not for what you and I think of as transmission, at the wholesale level. Yeah.
Okay.
You can see also, Brian, with the dollar figures, it couldn't be for the.
Right. It's almost inconsequential.
Right.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
Wendy, may I ask a question?
Sure. Lynn?
So obviously we don't do this every year. If memory serves, we do it every 4 or 5 years. Is that about right? And we don't use the same consultant every time we do it. We presumably shift vendors. My question is there something different about the allocation methodology that these consultants are using as compared with the last time we did it? And if not, if the answer is these are all pretty standard industry practices, then the question was, were we out of balance last time between residential and general service rate revenues? And if not, then how did we get out of balance over the last 4 or 5 years since the last time we did this?
I'd have to pull up the the last cost of service study, but it's been this way for a while. And it's been brought up before, and the board made the decision to keep it that way at the time. You know, thought processes can change over time, but some utilities do this still, and some don't.
But so is the answer, Dave, that last time we did it, general service was contributing more than what they cost us?
Yep.
That's been a practice? Okay.
Right. So I think I saw a raised hand from David Allen.
Yep. Go ahead.
David, you have a question there?
Yes, thanks. To contribute a bit of perspective from really about a decade and a half, as I believe our consultant noted last time, there has been essentially a general practice across the industry, across the country, for this cross-subsidy to happen. And I certainly recall from meetings way back there, as I said, well beyond a decade back, it was not conceded, but expected fundamentally that the, quote, general service was cross-subsidizing the ratepayers. And the real question is, how do we feel about that? And the consequences if we want to make an adjustment. There'll obviously be a significant rate impact, and to go to it, that's the reason why the cross-subsidy is there. The thought is that somehow other businesses can stand it more than the residences. Over to you.
Thank you. I think that's why we're having this conversation. Exactly. Alice,
So-
go ahead, Laura.
I was just going to add, so David's exactly right. I mean, I think the consultant acknowledged that this has been historically a frequent practice for general service to subsidize residential, but they did also say that they saw people moving away from this practice, and their recommendation to us is to transition rates to a cost of service. Now, whether we accept their recommendation or not is entirely, up to you. It's just, I thought I would mention those two things.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, Alice.
Do we know what other Massachusetts MLPs are doing in this regard? Is Massachusetts all looking to shift back the cost to the ratepayers, to the residential rate? Or are other municipalities?
Hold that thought.
Okay.
Hold that thought. We're gonna cover some of that in the slides to come.
Okay.
So I don't have too many more slides, but it may be, Wendy, if we could get back to that,
Yep,
just so we
let's
can
keep going.
finish up.
Yep.
Okay. So another request at the last meeting was that we outline decision points that the board needed to tee up in order for us to move on to later phases of the rate design piece of this work. And so Dave, if you go to, please, slide 12. Before we can move on to rate design, we have to determine the revenue requirements of the utility. That means how much money do we have to collect in total to run the plant? And in order to answer that question, we have to determine what is the return on rate base that you want to use in rates. What should the return on rate base be? And I would think that, you want to consider, well, what is the purpose of a return on rate base? And I know the question was asked at a previous meeting, is the return on rate base plus depreciation double counting? So we need to decide, okay, what's the return on rate base going to be? And then another element that you need to decide before we can move on to rate design is, once we determine the total that needs to be collected, we have to figure out who's going to collect what, because the consultant will take the totals per rate class and design rates that meet those totals per rate class. So both of these decision points, the return on rate base and the cross subsidy, have rate implications. As well as I know other items this board is considering, such as increases to the renewable energy surcharge. And really, it's going to be the combined impact on rates of factoring in the return on rate base, potentially transitioning to cost of service, and increased renewable energy surcharge increases that are going to impact rates. And so we've put together some slides on how CMLP's rates compare with other Massachusetts electric utilities. So Dave, if you'll go on to the next slide, and yep, there. What this is it is a chart prepared by
MWEC.
MWEC. Thank you. I was going to try to say the name out in full, but I decided I wasn't going to be able to do that. So we'll just stick with MWEC. These are all the Massachusetts utilities, including IOUs, and the IOUs are listed by region because they have different prices for different regions. If you're at the top, you're the most expensive. So Unitil, for this particular rate class, this is a residential rate for a small user, someone who uses like 250 kilowatt hours a month. You can see the unit, if you were the customer in Unitil service territory and you had this usage profile, you'd pay $71.23 a month. If you were in Peabody's service territory, you'd pay $26.83. If we look where Concord falls in this group, we are in the upper half of the pack at 4407. 40% of the utilities by number have higher rates than we do, and 60% have lower. So when you look at a number like 40%, you want that number to be high. You don't want it to be low. Because if the number's low, like 10%, that means only 10% of the utilities have higher rates and 90% have cheaper rates. The next slide shows, so remember 60-40, okay? 40% have higher, 60% have lower. If we go to the next slide, this is the same type of comparison for a commercial rate. This is a small commercial customer with no demand charge and less than 3,000 kilowatt hours of usage per month. And you can see now Concord is relatively higher in the stack. Only 25% of utilities have higher rates, and 75% of the utilities have a lower rate for this rate class. The next slide takes this concept and does a derivative of it in the sense that that number, the 40% or the 25%, is now charted. So generally, just, I know there's a lot of colors and numbers and stuff, but if we look at the chart on the right, which is residential rates, and we look at the chart on the left, they're both on the same scale, 0 to 60%. Do you see the bars are generally higher for residential than they are for commercial? That means that CMLP's residential rates are relatively, they fare relatively better in the stack than the commercial ones do. Each one of these colored lines within the residential or commercial graph is a different usage profile. So the one we looked at as a static comparison was for 250 kilowatt hours. That's the aqua number. We also look at what the bills look like for someone who uses 500 kilowatt hours a month, 750, and 1,000. And that's why there are 4 different bars for each date. Those are 4 different usage profiles. On the left, it's a similar construct. It's basically different sized commercial customers, with the aqua being the very small ones, and then the other colors left to right being relatively larger and larger. And we can see that that light aqua on the left is kind of the worst of our rates. I can see a low value here in September for the light blue line. I think it's about 17%, which means that only that 17% of the utilities had a higher rate and 83% had a lower rate.
For commercial.
for commercial. So our small commercial rate is the worst. Our residential rates are generally fare better than the commercial ones overall. And it does change over time, as you can see in this chart.
Where do large nonprofits, are those in the commercial? So, for example, Concord Academy, Middlesex, and Emerson Hospital.
Yeah, we do not have separate municipal or nonprofit rates other than they're non-taxable, right? They don't get it. They don't receive any taxes.
Right, but are they in the commercial? The large.
They're in commercial, correct?
Okay. Good.
Can a given entity move from category to category depending on their usage, or is it nailed down as a billing class?
They can move. It depends on the rules of the rate class. Sometimes, you need to be at a certain level for a certain number of months before we'll move you. It's not like instantaneous, so they're going back and forth between rate classes month to month. But as their usage profiles change, yeah, they can move to a different rate class.
So they could conserve, if they went on a program to conserve a substantial amount of power, they would move to a smaller rate class.
Potentially.
Okay.
Or they bought solar like 300 Baker Ave is thinking of.
Yeah, it will depend. Our rates are determined by the demand. So generally, your highest use hour is generally going to determine which rate class you're in. If you're over, 200 kilowatts, you're going to be in G3. If you're under 20, you're going to be in G1. And if you're in between that, you're going to be in G2.
But Laura, are you saying that does not matter? If you have solar, that's offsets the demand, but you're saying your rate category is based on the demand without the offset?
No, with the offset. But
okay.
So let's say you had solar, Peggy, but still the solar wasn't shining when you were using your max usage.
Right.
Then the solar wouldn't be mitigating. But if they were coincident, then yes, it would. So
you're looking at September, and the peak hour is what, 5 to 7 or something? 5 to 7 couple hours. So I think you're implying that there's not a whole lot of solar going on there.
That's possible. Yes, 5 to 6 p.m. would not be the peak solar hour
in September.
I mean, the peak was actually in August in 2017, but the reason it's being called September here is because our September bills, which we sent to them as September, right, are for August. So sure. I'm sorry, it's a little confusing.
Got it. Okay. Well, your command of this subject is impressive.
Brian has his hand up.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. Yeah. Brian, do you want to ask your question?
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Yes, thank you. Going to the coincident solar production question, we've looked at this many, many times over the years, and transmission peaks, generally solar is producing, not maximum, but producing during about half of those transmission peaks. And it has always produced during the capacity hour in the summer. Historically, doesn't guarantee future that it will always hit in the future, but it has historically. I just wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Well, can I ask another question? So going back to your rates, it seems like the smaller demand users have look less favorable, that they have higher rates. But then the larger ones, I'm losing track of the graph. Since our large general service area seems to be compensating for the smaller, how do our larger rates compare? Can you go back to that graphic where you had all the bars?
Dave, can you go back to slide number 16? So Wendy, you'd be asking about customers that are in the, like, you know, demand 1,000 or
Yeah.
demand 500. And what you'll see is, let's look at the most recent one in October. A lot of those hover around the 30% mark.
Okay.
So
That's-
those are better than that small commercial.
Yeah.
But not quite as good as the residential at 40%.
Okay. All right. Thank
Although
you.
there's not a huge difference, right? I mean,
There
Yeah.
isn't.
So a small commercial could be a store downtown or something like that.
Yep.
Okay.
so it could be that other municipals have a policy of cross-subsidizing the small commercial because they want to attract those businesses to their territory. I don't know. I'm just speculating. But, you know, that's one possible explanation why ours doesn't fare as well.
Right.
And,
So one thing for us to consider, presumably, is that we've had a fairly high industrial space vacancy rate in town. Still right, Dave?
Yeah, I
Industrial?
had it lately. But
Office parks, when I say industrial.
yeah, I believe some of the businesses are filling back up out on Virginia Road, but I haven't looked at it closely lately. I will.
And do we have any information that would suggest that utility rates are a factor in that decision?
I don't have any information on that.
I'd be really cautious about making any predictions about the future of occupancy of any of the businesses, small and large, anywhere in America, actually, not to mention out here in the suburbs. I certainly would want to try to do the most we can to preserve the character of Concord. And an important part of that is the charming retail in, you know, West Concord and 9 Acres and downtown Concord and so forth. Also the agricultural and so forth. So that, you know, I just feel like as if everything's up in the air. I just don't know how soon the economy is going to get going and how bad the damage has been here and what the rest of 2020 is going to bring. And so it's kind of ironic that we've just completed this study, but it's retrospective and it doesn't really help us think about the risks that lie before us.
Although that's a discussion the board can have, understanding what the realities are given COVID going forward for the policy decisions. David Allen has his hand up.
Thanks. David, do you want to ask your question?
This was in the back of the mind a couple of weeks ago, and now it's come to the foreground. Somebody will know and can enlighten us immediately, although I'll offer a perspective on it after I ask the question. There's a law that we can't subsidize, cross-subsidize, but I don't know, can't cross-subsidize from what to what. Dave, I have a feeling you'll know the answer to that question, Laura. You'll know. Clearly, we are seeing cross-subsidy here. On this larger subject, let me notice the interesting case of our light plant seeing itself enroll, setting what amounts to tax policy to shape the town. Ordinarily, in discussions like this, you're of the view that if you created a cost, you pay for that cost. And policy decisions about this, that, and the other thing get elevated up to the select board and town meeting, that sort of thing. But to stay on this first question, somebody will know what's the law, what can be cross-subsidized, what can't.
I haven't checked on that in a while, David, so I'd want to just check with our council because things have changed quite a bit over the time, but typically that applies with you know, rate discrimination and things of that nature. So I'll have to look into it. I don't want to give you an answer and be wrong. but we'll have to look into it and check.
So, much appreciated, for goodness sake. But kind of obviously, we're talking about rate discrimination here, whatever words we use. And if it's allowed, it's allowed. And then it's a question of how are we in an explicit fashion going to go there? Enough for me. Thanks.
Okay. We'll have to follow up on that separately. Laura, did you get through all your materials? I'm sorry.
I got through all the slides. The only other jack in the box I have is another Excel spreadsheet that will enable you to see how CMLP changes its place in the stack with different decisions on increasing rates. So to the I know in the past the board has asked, well, if we increase things a penny or a penny and a half, or we do this or that, how does that impact rates? What will that do to the average customer or the small customer? And how will CMLP's rates then compare to other utilities? So if you want to get into that discussion, we have a tool for that, but that's entirely up to you.
Perhaps I could ask what our plan is moving forward for today and for the subsequent meeting.
Yep. So I know you teed up some questions. I don't think that we're going to get through those today, Laura. We have a half an hour left. I know we still have our renewable energy credit discussion. Do we want to have more discussion on this now, or do we want to wait? We're meeting again in 2 weeks, so we can, as a board, think about these issues and come back. What were you looking to have for today, Laura?
Well, I'm an ambitious sort of person. And so my hope had been that you would provide guidance on the return on rate base and on whether or not it would be in Concord's and the ratepayers' best interests to transition the rate classes to their actual cost of service. I recognize that both of these questions are in the larger context of rates in general, and that you have other things you're considering, such as the renewable energy surcharge increases. And so, to my mind, those things should all be factored collectively to help inform, the best decision going forward.
So to some degree, getting to a cost of study, closing that gap is a question about over what period of time as well, right? I mean,
Correct.
One is directional, but one is time-based. And I know our cost of service study has like a 5-year look forward.
Yes.
I don't think I don't think we're going to, I don't know if we would close it in 5 years, but so there's a time dimension to that.
Well, the consultants have modeled out what a transition plan might look like to get to cost of service. And it is possible over the 5 years with about, and I need to look this up again, but I think it was roughly a 3% increase in rates. That doesn't include the rec surcharge increase. That's just what would be needed from the, and I'm talking about the residential rate.
3% per year?
Yeah, let me double check that. There's got to be a way for me to actually.
I mean, that's the question, right? What is the cumulative effect of either keeping 2% or moving to 3% on rate, return on rate base, of sticking now to our rec surcharge plan, and then also gradually moving to cost of service to correct the cross subsidy issue?
Bingo.
What is the general, what is the cumulative impact on residential rates over 5 years if we try to do some combination of that?
So I think it's both legal and typical to have different rate classes with different rate structures. Same thing with commercial taxes. I mean, we have flat tax between both residential and commercial. But right now, obviously, we do not have the same rate charge between commercial and residential for electricity. So I don't personally see that it's necessary to bring those two into line. Maybe small commercial is one thing and large commercial is another. I don't know, but
I-
Gordon is.
Alice?
So I have a question that sort of follows up with Peggy's, and that are we hearing complaints from the commercial sector that the rates are too high? And is that what is part of the factor that we should be considering, or is everybody pretty much saying our rates are pretty fair?
I'm not hearing a lot of complaints about the rates themselves. Carol, I don't know if you hear from customers.
No, I haven't had any feedback from customers saying that they thought that their rates were too high.
Gordon?
Yeah, it's interesting that two of the allocators that we discussed today relate to, in one case, dividing up the fixed overhead. And, how you do that in a fair way is as much a art as a science. The other one was connected in a complicated way with allocating the peak. And so I guess my question to you would be, as we move to smart meters and the ability to allocate the costs of, or determine who's using the peak and making them pay for the costs of that, wouldn't that actually have a tendency to address at least the latter of those two allocators?
Laura, do you want to comment?
Yeah, sure. So Gordon, I think it depends in large part on how we design the rates. If we were to add a residential demand component to our rates, I think we could address and use the rate to collect all of the peak costs. Then I think you're right. I think the cost of the peak could be allocated directly using the actual meter recordings from everybody's meter. So it would be completely fair. So it in part depends on how you design the rates. But the peak is just one component of all of the costs, as you mentioned. There are fixed costs, there are capital costs, and each one of those sort of has a different way of being looked at to allocate the costs.
Okay.
I mean, what I kind of like about that is that we're moving towards sort of making the two classes more and more equivalent by collecting the same data on them and billing them, similarly. It just seems more fair. And just generally speaking, I think it was last meeting, Peggy, you mentioned and you mentioned again today that the property tax is the same for both classes. I kind of like that. It's fair, but we can't actually equalize the rate structures between residential and commercial because they're actually based on different metrics. Demand charge. Do we still do phase power? We used to anyway. Those are two kinds of costs that residences aren't asked to pay.
So I'm glad you brought that up, Gordon. I think we'll get to this later, but I think it's very common to have split electric rates for residential and commercial. And the three examples I gave you for probably our largest commercial users do not pay taxes.
You know what?
Say that again, Peggy.
Some of our largest customers do not pay property tax. So comparing it to even property tax is,
Wow.
yeah, whatever, right?
That's an important observation. Yep.
There's a private schools and a hospital.
Right.
Yep.
Huge.
Okay. So
And they're not complaining.
right. Of course not.
Good point.
Let me just ask a quick question of the board. Do people want some more time to think about this? Do we have some focused requests for Laura so that we can get more direction? do people have a sentiment of trying to close this discrepancy? What are you thinking?
I think I just gave you my thoughts.
Yeah. Alice, do you have an opinion one way or the other?
I personally don't see a need to adjust the subsidy at this point. There are no people, unless, well, there's a comment from Jan that we should look at the commercial customer survey to see if there are any complaints. But
Okay.
if there are no complaints, and given what Peggy's comment is that there's often a different kind of subsidy being paid by a different rate class for, say, property tax, that I don't see a need to move the residential rates and pay its full cost at this point, especially when we're facing other rising costs for the ratepayers to fund our rec policy.
Okay. Lynn, do you want to comment any
Yeah,
further?
I would prioritize assessing rec surcharges.
Yeah.
For correcting the cost of service imbalance.
Yeah, I think I'd concur with you in particular on that issue.
I do too, Lynn, and I think that I think we should, if we don't want to bring the cost of service for commercial, large commercial, I think small commercial, we should maybe move toward equality, but the large commercial, if we don't, we just need to express a policy so that it's a decision and not happenstance.
Okay.
And Laura, what do you need from the board for Baker Tilly to continue?
So in order to move to further parts of the work, which is the rate design piece, we need the revenue requirement and we need it by class. So I need that return on rate base percentage, and I need to know what they want to do about moving to a cost of service. And I might just, since I have the mic, say what I just put in the chat room, which is, even if we're not getting any complaints from our commercial customers, I think the idea might be, well, we might be preventing new businesses from moving in, businesses for which electricity is, up on the list of important criteria. They're looking at Hudson, they're looking at other places, and they say, well, I'm just not going to locate in Concord. We don't ever hear that complaint, but I mean, I just feel like that could be a consideration.
Okay. And Gordon, any other final comments on that allocation?
I'm always kind of a little bit conservative about making any rapid changes, and if we do anything to address this, I would prefer to do it as part of the process of transitioning to time of use rates and smart metering.
So
Another issue, right? That's going to be happening in this 5-year period as well.
Right.
Yeah.
For us to have a conversation about designing new rates, I know we have to move forward with Baker Tilly, but the time of use rate, is that part of the output, that part of their deliverables now?
So what I'm trying to explain or say is that to get to rate design, to start talking about time of use and how we might design that, we have to decide, we have to determine, we have to pinpoint and not change the revenue requirement and the revenue requirement by rate class.
So Laura, if I'm not mistaken, you recommended 2%.
What?
She modeled
Your
2%.
rate of return.
Oh no, I'm not recommending. Please don't take my, please.
Well, okay, what does staff recommend between you and David? What do you recommend for the rate of return?
So in the past, it's been a range of 2 to 3%.
Right.
And we haven't always hit that, but that's what we've targeted around. And it seems like a reasonable number. You don't want to go too low because, if something happens and you don't meet your forecast, you could be going the other way. So you want to have enough there so that if you don't hit your target, you're still doing okay.
So I recommend 2%, which is.
Well, I was about to say 3%.
Or 2.5.
I was about to say 2.5 for that matter.
I was going to say
2.5,
2.5, right?
2.5, going.
2.5.
That's what I'd say, 2.5.
All right,
Split the difference.
2.5.
Excellent. Okay, we have a decision.
Does the board need to vote? And if so, we need to do roll call.
That's correct.
Do we have to make a vote on this? Okay, so,
A motion
Um,
and then a roll call vote.
Wendy, you can't move, you're the chair.
I know.
I
So
move
would
that-
somebody like to make a motion?
I move that we propose a rate of return of 2.5% in the budget.
Second.
All right, any discussion? No? Okay, let me take a roll call.
I'll
Lynn?
second.
Oh,
Yes.
second. Thanks, Alice. Lynn?
Yes.
Peggy?
Yes,
Gordon?
Yes.
All right, Wendy says yes. Alice?
Yes.
Okay, unanimous, 2.5%. And then in terms of the allocation, I'm getting the sentiment from the board that people are not interested in closing the gap on the allocation between the differential between the large general service and the residential. I think that's what I've generally heard, because there's too many moving parts right now and people want to see how the rates would play out. Is that a fair statement?
Fair
Yes.
statement.
Okay, all right.
Does that need a vote?
Does that need a vote? That we're going to leave the current subsidization, if you will, between general and residential as is?
I think we should vote.
I think it should be a vote. And we might want to have a discussion about small businesses
Mhm.
in this pandemic, and should we do anything? They're struggling. So, I don't know, Stephen, if you want to add anything to that, you're dealing with them more directly.
Yeah, I think, and I'm trying to track the conversation about the rate structures, but I was late to this, so I apologize. But I think there's an ongoing discussion about our small business community and their needs, and because of the way things are currently structured, there's not a lot of flexibility to help them during this time. I know there's, we can defer, under the governor's orders, utilities, you can have interest-free payment plans, and you can, there's no shut-off, so they could just not pay their bills, but that debt remains. And is there a way to provide some level of relief? I'm not sure that there is. I don't understand all this well enough, but I just know that we're getting a lot of feedback from the business community that any amount of relief could be helpful. So I don't know what vehicle there is to do that, but I feel obligated to say that, that the feeling out there that the town should be doing something to help financially. And I know the CMLP is basically a separate business, but it is still something that we could do for our customers as well. I mean, I agree with the approach on large scale users, and when you think of some of our larger users, they are tax exempt, but our small businesses, and I think, as you all know, a lot of times the utility charges accrue to the business person, not the property owner. And so it would be, anything you could do would be a direct benefit to, the restaurateur or the shopkeeper, as opposed to the larger property owners.
Thanks for that comment, Steve. So I think what you missed earlier is the cross subsidization really predominantly was about the large general service and the medium service offsetting the residential. I, for one, wouldn't want to impact the small general service or increase those rates. And my guess is that's probably what the sentiment of the board is as well.
agreed.
Right.
I would actually like to suggest that small businesses be in that 40th percentile, the way residences have been.
Okay.
They're not as disadvantaged right now. General service rate classes, they're in the lowest percentile, and that seems counterintuitive to me. So we could aim for them to be similar to the residential class in terms of where we sit relative to other utilities rates. I think that
I agree with you, Lynn. I will say that as a business owner and leaseholder and whatnot, electricity is not like the biggest bill, but it's definitely, if we can do something that's an indicator, it's working.
I was wondering what the percentage difference, what percentage of the overall base cost of operating a business in Concord is related to energy costs. I would assume rent is far greater.
Far greater. I'm not running a restaurant with, maybe the gas bill's higher. I'm not running a hair salon with, well, they can't use the hair dryers right now. But, you know, electric's pretty low.
Mhm.
I mean, I guess what I would say is, and I don't know what the property owners, the landlords are gonna do in terms of rent deferral or rent relief. I just have viewed this from the beginning as we should do everything we can just because it's the right thing to do.
Exactly. Even if it's token, we should do it.
Okay.
I
So,
would agree with that. As long as we acknowledge that even if it's token, we should do it because it sets a business climate for the town.
correct. So I think Lynn had a, sorry.
I'm sorry, going back to one of Laura's comments, which I thought was quite wise. You know, if down the road there's, well, the Virginia Road properties and some other large commercial properties, if we're trying to attract, you know, a lab or a you know, wet lab type of use, or a, you know, information technology where there's much higher electric demand, then, you know, it seems like there's a place where we could negotiate a specific deal for a specific tenant. Because there are those users out there that have a very high demand. But right now, I think the plan of kind of sticking with the two-tiered, what I would describe as a two-tiered system, and putting small business into the residential tier is kind of what we're all agreeing on.
Okay, well, we're getting into rate design, but we want to wrap up this one topic. So from a allocation perspective, I think we're saying that we're really not addressing the small general and expecting any kind of rate increase. Lynn had a great recommendation around the target of keeping that rate at about 40%, similar to the commercial. Does somebody want to make a motion so that we can give Laura the guidance that she needs around this cross-subsidization?
I move that as we consider, I move that as we consider revising rates for the smallest general service rate class, we seek to make their rate, what's the right wording? Comparable in percentile distribution relative to other greater Massachusetts utilities, comparable to residential rate classes. What's the right way of saying that, Laura?
So I think there are two issues here. One is, and what I hear you saying is that the board votes to not pursue transitioning the medium and large general service customers. Well, actually, it doesn't wish to pursue transitioning to cost of service rates at this time. I think that's all you need to vote on.
Okay.
And then separately, I think you could say that your guidance, but we're getting into rate design, and there might be a rate hearing or something we have to do. I don't know. Let's ask Dave. But at a later time, what I hear you saying is, let's try to design our small commercial rates so we fall closer to that 40th percentile, just like we are with residential rates compared to other Massachusetts utilities.
Okay.
So moved.
So those are two motions.
All
One
right.
is, those are two motions I think that we need to take
Correct.
and take a vote on. So let's take the first motion.
Yeah, so the first one, as it relates to the treatment of the small general service as it relates to residential, the way that was described earlier. Can we take a roll call on that? Lynn, I'll start with you.
Yes.
Alice?
Yes.
Gordon?
Yes.
And Wendy says yes. All right. And then on the second motion, which is to not pursue cross-subsidization right now for the large and medium general service and against residential.
I would.
Wait. Not to pursue cross-subsidization, or not to undo.
Undo, yeah.
Okay.
So not to change the current.
Current cross-subsidization,
Yeah.
correct.
Maybe instead of using the word subsidization there or cross-subsidization, we should simply say that the board does not wish to pursue a transitioning to cost of service rates at this time.
Okay.
Okay.
I would second that.
Okay. All right, we'll take a roll call.
So moved. Yeah.
Lynn? Yes. Alice?
Yes.
Gordon?
Yes.
Yes. Wendy, yes. All right,
Thank you
unanimous.
too.
And then
And Peggy, yes.
Yes,
So I'm sorry. I just keep skipping you there. Sorry.
well, I know, it's a terrible video.
No. Okay, so I want to just do a little reality time check because I know some people have to leave. It's 6 o'clock. Dave, how late can you stay?
I
You
have
have
a
a
hard
hard
stop at
stop.
6:15.
It's 6:15. Okay.
Yeah, I have another meeting
So,
to get to.
all right. So we do have the next topic is on the renewable energy credit strategy, which we had talked about back in March. And I don't know, Dave, if you had anything that you wanted to share in relation to this. I know that we had talked about in March wanting to continue to pursue the strategy that we outlined back in 2017 to increase that rate by an additional 5 cents.
By half a cent.
Half a cent. Half a cent, yes.
So it's currently,
5.
we added in the energy charge when we started this out. And we've been buying renewable energy credits and retiring them. And that process has gone well. When the board adopted that policy, there was a 4-step piece to it. And in the second year, well, it took a while to get it adopted, right? About a year. Then we implemented the penny, but we purchased much more than we thought we were going to have to. So it looked favorable that we were going to be at 100% for last year. But then the rec market went through the roof, and we ended up probably in a similar spot to where we were the year before. So the proposal is to raise it half a penny moving forward, and that's what we were discussing in March, and then it kind of just fell flat. Obviously, we didn't meet for a while, but that's the discussion that needs to be had. You know, if we increase it half a penny, you know, that's going to help move forward. But if we're going to get 100% carbon free, we're not going to do it at a penny in the energy charge. The proposal that was adopted was a 4-step piece, and we've done the first step, and I think it's time to strongly consider the second step.
So, and is consideration of the next step up dependent on our cost of service study, or can we decide to do that now?
It's not dependent on the cost of service.
Okay. Well, I certainly support increasing the rates to move along in implementation of that plan.
I would agree with that. That was option B.
Yep. Gordon?
I agree with that.
Okay, and I would certainly agree with it too. I think just
I also agree with it.
Peggy, thanks. I lost your face there this time. So let me just ask another question. I think the other question was whether we want to, as a board, we really want to stick to an annual schedule of reevaluating and increasing as appropriate at the time. But we didn't need to commit ourselves to reevaluating this as the policy had originally outlined. So I think that's important that we as a board commit to that as well.
I mean, we certainly should reevaluate every year. That doesn't mean we take action. You know, I don't know what the impact of all of this other rate design work is going to be, abuse rates is going to be. But yes, every year we should raise this issue and consider how to move forward. In my opinion.
I think we definitely should, because, you know, the rec rates, the pricing is, you know, to be determined. And this year, you know, staff came to us and basically said, we're not going to have enough money. So I think we should make sure that you know, we run that up the flagpole every single year.
Yep.
I agree.
Yep.
So do we think that a half a cent is the right increase for this year, given the rates that are projected?
I think it's an appropriate increase. It's not drastic. We wanted to kind of ease into this and, you know, do a phased approach opposed to doing it all at once. And I think that's still important because, you know, it is an increase to the rates, albeit it's a small increase, but it is. And I think if we went to the full number, it would be pretty hefty lift.
Drastic.
Okay, what was the full number? Was it 3 cents?
2.5.
2.5.
Yeah, okay.
So the timing that we actually had the consultant model in the rates was to do the first half-cent increase, the one you're talking about today, effective July 1st. We won't make that now, but sometime in 2020. And then do the next half-cent increase in January of 21, and the final half-cent increase, which would bring us to 2.5 cents in January of 22.
So at each interval, there's one that would happen as soon as we can at 0.5 cent. 6 months later, a second 0.5%, and then a year later.
Yeah, and we would evaluate it as we go to make sure that, if it's not needed because the rec prices drop for some reason, then we wouldn't have to do that increase at that time.
Can I just ask Dave, in the same way that we've asked you about small businesses and how much they are hurting, are we hearing from residential ratepayers that the current economic shock is preventing people from paying their utility bills?
No.
Okay.
I'm going to defer to Carol a little too.
Yeah.
I think so.
Okay. I've seen a couple hands raised. Gordon, can I ask you to speak? Your hand's been up a couple times.
Sure. I just, if we're comparing today's decision of 0.5 cent to a potentially more ambitious increase today, I would say that I would be happy to stick with 0.5 cent, but have a commitment, ask for a commitment from staff and this group to be sure to revisit again in early 2021. And because we have let these decisions kind of slide out and get coupled to other decisions that we're making and so forth. So let's keep it small for now, but also keep that schedule going.
Yeah, and we're going to have to do a vote on this in the July meeting. We'll do a rate hearing and all that. But we can show you, there's a tool that we can show you what 0.5 penny, what a penny, what 2.5 pennies, what it does and where it puts us in that chart. So we'll plan on sharing that so you guys can really see what each change does. Laura, tool and it's really helpful. So
okay, that's helpful.
Can I ask, if we accumulate more than we need in a given year's purchase, can we bank that money in a rec fund so that to compensate for fluctuating costs as recs over time?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, we also said we could use it for energy purchases when we voted the rec chart, so it didn't have to be used for recs. But anyways, Stephen, you had raised your hand earlier. Sorry.
Well, to answer the question about residential payments, I was going to compare it to property tax collections, but then realizing Carol's right there and can give you actual information, I'm going to mute myself.
All right. Thank you. Okay, so I'm getting a sense that the board's ready to take a vote on this for the July meeting, Dave. Yeah. We'll have a rate hearing formally, et cetera, but certainly have our sentiment at this point.
So will the July meeting be also a rate hearing?
Yes, July 8th. Yeah.
Good. Okay.
Yep. Okay.
So, just one clarification. For that rate increase, the reason why we're holding it to July is because we have to post a rate hearing. This did not have the hearing posted.
Okay.
So we have a sense of the board now. Now we can actually physically have the board take a vote, assuming we have the agenda posted properly. That's just Brian had a Q&A in there, and that's just answering his question.
Okay. All right.
And
Brian,
when would this rate go into effect, by the way?
That's something that you guys will have to vote on when you want it to be effective. We'll give you guidance on it because it is some work that Carol and her team will have to do to get the system set up. So when we come to the July meeting, we'll come with a recommendation for the board's consideration, which will include a date.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. And did I hear that Brian had a question?
Well, he had it in the Q&A. I just answered it.
Oh, okay, you answered. All right, sorry. Too many multitasks.
Sorry.
Okay. All right, so we have direction for July, recognizing that it's 6:06. Can we just move on? I don't know if that we have any liaison updates, but are there questions from the public or comments? that we want to address at this point?
We have one from Brian.
Okay. Brian, do you want to speak to your question?
Yes. I just wanted to say thank you for doing the cost of service study. These are always helpful. I'd like to request the slides that were shown be made available. And I've talked to Laura and heard through her about the Excel sheet that's used to do this cost of service study. It does a great job of mapping expenses to how they're collected for. That I know that there's some confidential information on that about pricing with your PPAs. Is there any way you could redact any of that confidential information and make that mapping of line items for expenses to customer classes and groups so that we can really understand the details of how these rates, the math works behind these rates?
We'd have to take a look at it, Brian, to see how we could make it readily available without, compromising the confidentiality piece.
Thank you. Just whatever you can share, that would be helpful. Just as much detail as you can share would be appreciated.
All right. I think all our other questions might have been answered. Any other comments from the board? Anything else to add to the meeting? No?
I would just like, and if we have enough time, there's kind of this crisis that's going on right now, and the town is looking for ways to respond to it.
Which one?
Yeah,
exactly.
It's awful. And so, I'm kind of wondering if maybe it's, I know we have enough to think about as it is, but to think about any possible ways that we could add on to the systems that we have now to kind of step in and help people out. We talked a little bit about the difficulties that small businesses are having. We really don't want to lose the character of our town, and the small business presence is a huge part of that. Gordon Optical shut down there on Commonwealth Ave. There are others. So, could there be something like the Hugh Cargill or some kind of opt-in program that residents could maybe, volunteer to pay in, basically a charity or something like that, some kind of fund that we could use to create some Steve?
Yeah, the community chest is actually doing an excellent job facilitating a lot of that. So I would encourage people who are interested in doing that to talk to Jennifer at the community chest. Hugh Cargill is there. We also have the community town donations. There's a variety of ways to do that, but the community chest is really taking a leadership role on this. There's also an organization called Concord Together, which is a group of business volunteers who have formed a coalition to kind of consolidate information and be the voice of businesses. They've done a couple of surveys that have been very helpful. That's one of the reasons why I know rent and utilities are by far the top concern. And even though it may be rent and utilities, we can only control what's within our purview. And if we can help out even a little bit, I think we have an obligation to do that. And I would say, to go back to the impact on residences in the town, I don't know. I mean, if Carol wanted to offer data on our payments for the last couple of months, but tax collections were very strong. Although that was back in June 1st was the end of the quarter. August 1st may be a better sign of what, if any, impact it's had. But it really is the business community. Many residents, the businesses for many residents didn't shut down, so they were able to continue to telework or do whatever. But businesses couldn't open their doors. And so there's a big, big difference between impacts on, in fact, I was looking at a survey from Suffolk. I don't mean to go too far down the rabbit hole, but like 67% didn't lose income during this, but small businesses absolutely did. So that's why I kind of made that ask of the board.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And
Got a
Gordon-
comment, Wendy?
Yeah, and Gordon, and we really stuck with that, you know, the residential assistance program.
Right.
Was going to be
Lynn?
my question. That was going to be my question. In my day job, I'm looking at the effect of COVID on economies in Southeast Asia. And I know that a number of countries are offering utility payment deferrals or decreases as a way of helping. And I just wonder, you said we haven't had many people come, Carol, to ask for help, but is it worth it to put something on the website about willingness to negotiate extended payment schedules or something?
Yes, we've actually had something on the website and on our bill messages as well, indicating that people can give us a call, email if they're having any kind of trouble. We're here to help. And I'm actually kind of surprised that we haven't had more commercial customers and residential customers reach out to us. I expected to have an onslaught, but I think we've only had maybe about a half a dozen commercial customers, most of them being smaller commercial customers. And I can't really say that we've had an uptick in residential customers. We have just, actually since March, we suspended all of our collections efforts for all of the utilities. Our plan is to gradually start to get back into that. I don't believe that we'll be doing any shutting off of customer services for probably the rest of the summer. Maybe by October, we'll play it by ear. And even at that, it may end up being this year. We'll just do our letter campaign and talk to people, but we won't take it any further than that. I do have, a fair amount of commercial customers that I do talk with, and those are the ones that I've had reach out to me directly and ask for assistance. But like I said, it hasn't been the volume that I was expecting it would be. So I'm kind of thinking that we may have an onslaught, maybe by August or so. At this point, it hasn't been that bad.
Maybe if we did a direct mail to the businesses, it might raise the awareness that there's something out there rather than make them come to you or to come to us by looking at the website or reading their bills carefully.
Yeah,
A direct mail might be a better approach.
And it was in the bills, right, Carol? So
yes,
that's about as good as you're going to get, right? Right there.
yes.
Right.
It depends who reads the bill, right?
Yeah.
Well, but someone's got to pay it.
Yeah,
Right.
no one's
True.
that's been a persistent
the
problem
problem.
with us. Sorry.
Yeah.
You pay online, you don't look at the bill.
Exactly.
Well,
And if you
okay.
pay automatic pay, you don't look at the bill often.
Exactly.
We've been, like I said, Concord Together has been a communication bridge for us. We've talked to them about this information. There's the Economic Vitality Committee. We've been getting the word out. I think I will say there's a sense, I think, of overwhelm amongst many small businesses, which is one of the reasons why they may not, many of them may not even know which direction to turn.
Mm-hmm.
And when you're looking at a pile of bills, your $100 electric bill may be the last thing you're thinking about, which is why I'm saying we want to be proactive in developing the tools, and then we can basically try and employ them on behalf of the businesses, or say, hey, do a little more hand-to-hand outreach for specific cases versus the broadcast, which I found limited effectiveness with over these last few weeks, where we've been working really hard to try and connect with businesses. It really gets down to case by case.
Yeah.
And what I would suggest is that we talk about this in the July meeting. We can come up with some creative solutions, whether it's credits or they apply for something. We can do that if that's helpful, and I think it probably would be.
Yeah, good.
I know Dave has to leave, so can I make a
Yep,
motion?
I know. I think we're done. But I'll entertain a motion.
Wait,
Just
wait,
me.
Nope,
I'm sorry.
Sorry.
Mike's
Sorry,
gonna
just-
say that.
Okay, Stephen.
Sorry, just one more point. I think if you're going to have this discussion in July, I would recommend that we invite someone from Concord Together or the Economic Vitality Committee to participate in the discussion, and maybe they can articulate what the needs are.
No, it's a good idea.
Good idea.
Thank you.
And Mike Lawson has his hand up.
Okay, sorry. Mike? I'm sorry, I'm not good at,
It wasn't
at
there a
hands.
second ago, don't worry.
is he still there? Mike, are you still there? Are you muted?
He's not muted. I can't hear him.
Okay.
I'm on enough of these with him to know that he's been having technical difficulties.
Okay. All right. Well, oh, wait, he's got his hand raised again. I did see it.
I see his hand's gone now.
Yeah.
Questions answered.
He didn't answer. Did he type?
No,
No chats?
I see nothing in the chat and nothing in the Q&A.
Okay. All right. Well, I don't
So-
want to deny him the chance, but I think we need to wrap up our meeting.
I think
So I
Lynn
can
had a motion to adjourn, and I'll second that.
All right. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All right. Well, thank you
Thanks,
all.
all.
Thank you
Appreciate
all.
for your patience. Thanks, Laura and Dave, for all your work.
And Laura, would you be able
Thanks.
to send to all of us a copy of the PowerPoint that you used?
Yeah, that'd be great.
Sure, no
It'll
problem.
also help me, with the minutes.
Thank you. Oh, no, there's Michael. He's lost.
He said thank you.
Did he? Okay. All right. Well, thank you all.
He said thank you for all your hard work and keep it up.
Thanks, Peggy.